is not just deregulation, but privatization of everything. And in Capitalism and Freedom, he lays out his wish list, everything from the post office to national parks. So I think it's interesting to think about how this crisis will affect future plans for privatization, and in fact it already is. Because the next big bubble, and by the way, this idea of bubbles is intimately connected to the idea of governments who think that their role is simply to create the context for maximum profit seeking. I mean, that you just get out of the way. Anything that makes money is good, even if it's entirely divorced from the real economy. If it inflates, your GDP is still going up. And the next big bubble, they went from .com to housing, is projected to be infrastructure. The crisis, and this is where Friedmanism becomes a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you neglect the public sphere. And because you have tax cuts and because you've derided the public sphere, and we certainly saw this in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, which was not a natural disaster, it was a disaster born of a collision between heavy weather and weak infrastructure. But then that was used to rationalize really just erasing the public sphere altogether, closing Charity Hospital, the only hospital that treats the uninsured in New Orleans, closing down the public housing projects. Richard Baker, a Republican congressman, said we couldn't clean out the housing projects, but God did. Milton Friedman, and I start the book with this story, wrote a piece, was one of his last pieces of writing, his last major policy recommendation. He wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal saying that it was an opportunity, the fact that parents and teachers and children were scattered across the United States after Hurricane Katrina, an opportunity to radically remake the education system. Now that, and of course turn it to a voucher system. Now, that neglect of the public sphere that we saw in New Orleans is of course a national crisis. The American Society of Civil Engineers estimates that there is a deficit, an infrastructure deficit, of between $1.5 trillion and $2 trillion just to bring the roads and bridges up to safety standards. And the solution, up until very recently, that was being held up was public-private partnerships, was privatization of essential infrastructure. You know this in Chicago because the airport's one of the ones on the block. But one interesting thing that happened today is that the biggest test case for infrastructure privatization is the Pennsylvania Turnpike, which was on the verge of being handed over to a consortium of private companies on a 75-year lease. And that deal fell through today, and I think part of the reason why it fell through is because one of the companies leading the consortium was Citigroup. And the idea of putting more essential services, more things that are far too important to fail in the hands of the same people that have made such a mess of the financial sector suddenly seems like insanity. But on the other hand, the economic pressures on states, on the federal government, it's only going to increase, right? Because it seems inevitable that those private debts are going to be transferred onto the public books. So nothing can be taken for granted in this moment. The other place where I think we see the legacy of Friedmanism in this moment is in the backlash to the Wall Street bailout. The backlash that essentially killed the bill in Congress, although it's clear that it's going to be revived. People got very, very frightened yesterday when the stock market had its worst day, and they called their Congress people with another message. And I just want to say on that front that it's easy to conclude from that people are just untrustworthy and they shouldn't really have a say in the economy, which is, I think, probably what Milton Friedman would say. And this was part of the impulse towards specialization and treating everything economic as hard science, because that means that it's out of reach of democracy. It's not subject to any debate. These are hard rules. Now, I think that the sort of volatility we've seen in the markets the past few days is at least partially the result of the incredible recklessness of the Bush administration in dangling a $700 billion bailout, just free money, saying we're going to do this, before they had any guarantee that they were going to be able to do it. So of course the stock market rallies at the prospect of free money. Why wouldn't it? And then when it falls through, of course it dips. And I'm not saying this is all planned, but this sort of roller coaster we've been on has just been part of this pattern of incredibly poor management, poor government that infuses every aspect of this crisis. And this, of course, is also part of the ideology, because the Bush administration, far from being an aberration, is really the culmination of the idea that government is the problem, not the solution. I think they really believe that. And totally abdicated their responsibility to manage, to govern. The popping of the housing bubble was a surprise to no one. But the only preparation was a 2.5-page plan presented by Henry Paulson that said, give me $700 billion and don't ask any questions. That's not preparing, right? This was laissez-faire in action, really scary kind of laissez-faire. But the anger is, of course, the anger at Wall Street, this sort of, there was a vindictive quality to a lot of what the Congress people heard from their constituents. Why should we bail them out? Look at what they've done to us. And it was Main Street versus Wall Street. And this is another failure of Friedmanism, because the idea of the ownership society was that class consciousness was supposed to disappear, right? Because union members we're not going to think of themselves as workers, because everybody owned a piece of the stock market and everybody was going to have a mortgage, so they would think like owners, they would think like bosses, they would think like landlords, not like tenants, not like workers. Class is suddenly back in America with a vengeance, and it is the result of this class war that was waged from this school. Now, interestingly, there is another Chicago boy, and Barack Obama is responding to the market crisis by turning his campaign really into a referendum, though he wouldn't call it a referendum on Friedmanism. He seems to be turning it into